Billionaire Nathan Whitmore disguised himself as a broke maintenance worker to find out if any woman could care about him without knowing his fortune. At a speed dating night, almost everyone rejected him. Everyone except Grace. She never asked about his money. And when she spotted an abandoned old Labrador trembling beneath a car in the pouring rain, she gave the dog her only coat. Nathan thought that was the moment everything changed. But weeks later, the same dog escaped and led them 2 miles across town to an abandoned house Nathan recognized immediately, because his company was about to destroy it. A cold November rain swept through Nashville, turning the downtown streets silver beneath the streetlights. Wind rattled bare branches along the sidewalks while warm amber light spilled from the windows of a modest event hall on Church Street. Nathan Whitmore had spent most of his adult life learning how quickly money could change the way people looked at him. At 43, he was a tall, broad-shouldered man with dark brown hair beginning to gray at the temples, a square jaw, deep-set blue-gray eyes, and a neatly trimmed beard that made his already angular face appear harder than he truly was. Years of boardrooms and negotiations had taught him to speak calmly even when angry, to watch people before trusting them, and to reveal almost nothing he could not take back. As founder and majority owner of Whitmore Development, one of the largest residential development companies in the American South, Nathan possessed more money than he could reasonably spend in several lifetimes. Yet wealth had gradually become less like freedom and more like a wall. Women rarely met Nathan without eventually discovering the Whitmore name. After that, conversations changed. Questions about childhood became questions about properties. Casual dinners became suggestions about vacations. Compliments somehow found their way toward his houses, cars, or connections. None of those women were necessarily cruel, and Nathan knew wealth complicated relationships in ways he could not blame entirely on others. Still, repeated disappointment had carved suspicion into him. Daniel Brooks was one of the few people who remembered Nathan before any of it. 44, compact and athletic, with warm brown skin, closely cropped black hair, and a short salt and pepper beard, Daniel had been Nathan's closest friend since college. He possessed an irritating talent for recognizing Nathan's excuses before Nathan finished making them. Maybe the problem isn't women, Daniel had told him 3 days earlier. Maybe nobody gets a chance to meet Nathan before they meet Whitmore. That conversation had produced tonight's ridiculous experiment. Nathan left his tailored clothes at home. He wore faded jeans, work boots, a charcoal flannel shirt, and an old canvas jacket. Daniel loaned him his 17-year-old Chevrolet pickup, complete with a dented tailgate and a heater that sounded like it was chewing gravel. At the speed dating event, Nathan introduced himself simply as a maintenance worker who repaired apartments and was trying to get back on his feet. By the time he reached table 8, he almost regretted coming. One woman had asked whether he owned a house within 90 seconds. When Nathan said no, her interest faded almost visibly. Another asked his approximate yearly income with the efficiency of a loan officer. A third smiled apologetically and admitted she wanted someone more established. Nathan could hardly condemn them for wanting security. What troubled him was how quickly he seemed to disappear once they believed he had none. His right hand tightened beneath the table. Then Grace Miller sat across from him. She was 32, tall and slender without appearing fragile, with fair skin warmed by faint freckles across her nose, hazel green eyes, and long chestnut brown hair gathered loosely behind her head. Several strands had escaped around her face because the rain had ruined whatever careful arrangement she had started with. She wore a simple cream sweater beneath a navy coat and almost no jewelry. There was nothing calculated about her appearance. Grace had never married, partly because she had learned early that loneliness was not the worst reason to remain alone. Choosing the wrong person merely to escape it was worse. She worked at a small neighborhood library and spent several afternoons each month volunteering at an animal rescue outside Nashville. Years of dealing with frightened animals and lonely library patrons had given her a patient manner. She noticed discomfort before status. Grace glanced at Nathan's face, then at the hand he had unconsciously brought onto the table. His fingers were clenched. "Are you nervous?" she asked. Nathan stared at her. Then he laughed. It was not the controlled chuckle he used during business dinners. It escaped him unexpectedly, warm and almost boyish. "A little," he admitted. "Good," Grace said. "I was worried I was the only one." For the next 5 minutes, She never asked where he lived, what he earned, or what kind of car he drove. She asked whether he liked old books. Nathan asked why she volunteered with animals. Grace told him frightened dogs were surprisingly good judges of character. They don't care what you do for a living, she said. Mostly they care whether you're going to hurt them. The word stayed with Nathan after the bell rang. An hour later, the event ended. Rain hammered the parking lot. People hurried toward their cars beneath umbrellas and jackets held over their heads. Nathan stood beneath the awning, watching Grace cross toward an aging Honda. Suddenly she stopped. She crouched beside a parked SUV and looked underneath it. Nathan saw movement. A dog was wedged beneath the vehicle. It was an elderly black Labrador, perhaps 11 years old, painfully thin beneath a rain-soaked coat. Gray fur covered its muzzle and eyebrows, and one rear leg trembled whenever it shifted its weight. A faded leather collar hung loosely around its neck. The old animal stared at Grace with exhausted brown eyes, but was too frightened to approach. Grace dropped to both knees directly onto the wet pavement. "Hey, sweetheart," she whispered. The Labrador recoiled. Grace did not grab for him. She simply sat there in the rain. Nathan watched people hurry past them. Grace slowly removed her navy coat. She was left wearing only the thin cream sweater as the cold rain soaked her shoulders. Then, inch by inch, she pushed the coat beneath the SUV until part of it reached the trembling dog. The Labrador sniffed it. After several seconds, he lowered his gray head onto the fabric. Grace smiled. Nathan remained beneath the awning, strangely unable to move. He had spent years wondering whether kindness disappeared when there was nothing to gain from it. Now a woman who believed he was nearly broke was kneeling in freezing rain, giving her only coat to an abandoned old dog who could give her absolutely nothing in return. Nathan stepped into the rain, and for the first time in years, he wondered whether he had finally met something his billions could never buy. Nathan stepped into the rain and helped Grace coax the old Labrador from beneath the SUV. 20 minutes later, Daniel's battered pickup was carrying two soaked strangers and one trembling dog toward a 24-hour veterinary clinic on the edge of Nashville. Dr. Helen Carter examined him. She was a sturdy woman in her late 50s with short silver blonde hair, pale blue eyes, and the calm, practical manner of someone who had spent 30 years handling frightened animals and frightened owners. The Labrador was dehydrated and underweight, with arthritis in his hips and an old scar running several inches along his left rear leg. Nothing suggested recent abuse, but everything suggested neglect. Helen passed a scanner over his shoulders. A beep sounded. "Walter," she said after checking the microchip database. 11 years old. Grace smiled at the dog. "Walter, that suits you." The smile faded when Helen called the registered number. It had been disconnected. The listed address appeared outdated as well. Walter had an identity, but apparently no one waiting to claim him. By midnight, the practical problem became unavoidable. The rescue where Grace volunteered was already beyond capacity. Helen could keep Walter overnight for observation, but afterward, he would need somewhere to go. "I'll take him," Grace said. Nathan looked at her. "You told me you rent." "I do." "And your landlord?" Grace hesitated. Her lease allowed small pets, not 70-pound Labradors. "That's tomorrow's problem." Nathan almost smiled, but something in her expression stopped him. "Why are you doing this?" Grace looked through the examination room window. Walter was lying beneath a blanket, his gray muzzle resting between his paws. "Because if I walk away tonight," she said quietly, "he may think nobody is coming back for him again." Nathan had negotiated contracts worth hundreds of millions without losing his composure. That sentence somehow found a place none of those numbers could reach. Grace took Walter home the following afternoon. What Nathan expected to be one unusual night became several unexpected weeks. He kept seeing Grace, still allowing her to believe he repaired apartment buildings for a living. Their meetings were almost embarrassingly ordinary. They walked Walter slowly through neighborhood parks because his arthritic hips could manage only short distances. They ate burgers from a roadside stand where grease soaked through the paper wrappers. One Saturday, they repaired a damaged section of fencing at the animal rescue. Nathan discovered that ordinary work was considerably harder when nobody else was being paid to do it. On Sunday, he attempted to build Walter a raised wooden bed. Walter watched from the porch with an expression Nathan interpreted as professional disappointment. "That board is backward," Grace said. "It is structurally creative." "It's backward." Nathan turned it around. Grace laughed, and Nathan found himself laughing with her. Later, while Walter slept nearby, their conversation became quieter. Grace revealed that she had almost married at 27. Her former fiancé had been decent, dependable, and ready for marriage. That had been part of the problem. I kept telling myself I should be happy, she said. Everyone else thought I was lucky. What changed? I realized I was more afraid of being alone than I was excited about spending my life with him. Grace had returned the ring 3 weeks before the wedding. It hurt both of them, but she believed marrying someone from fear would have created a slower, crueler heartbreak. I'd rather be alone for the right reason than stay with someone for the wrong one. Nathan looked down at his hands. Grace had walked away from a comfortable future because she refused to build a relationship on something untrue. And Nathan was building theirs on exactly that. Several times he nearly confessed. Each time fear stopped him. He told himself he needed another week, another conversation, another chance for Grace to know the man before discovering the fortune attached to him. But every good day made the lie heavier. Walter, meanwhile, developed his own opinion. The old Labrador began waiting beside the door when Nathan arrived. During walks, he frequently drifted toward Nathan's leg. One evening, after dinner at Grace's small rental house, Walter ignored the padded bed they had built and lowered himself directly across Nathan's work boots. Grace looked down and smiled. Looks like he chose you. Nathan rested a hand on Walter's gray head. The dog released a tired sigh and closed his eyes. For a moment, Nathan felt something dangerously close to belonging. He did not notice Walter's worn leather collar shifting beneath his fingers, revealing the edge of a small metal tag hidden underneath. Nor could he know that the old dog sleeping peacefully on his boots was carrying the first clue to a secret that could destroy everything Nathan was beginning to hope for. 3 weeks after Walter came home with Grace, an unusually warm December afternoon settled over Nashville. Grace had left the back door open while carrying laundry outside when Walter suddenly lifted his head, stared toward the street, and bolted through a loose section of the side gate. Walter! Grace dropped the basket and ran after him. Nathan, who had been tightening a hinge on the porch, followed immediately. For an 11-year-old Labrador with arthritic hips, Walter moved with surprising determination. He never sprinted for long. Instead, he trotted, slowed when pain caught his rear leg, then pushed forward again. Nathan tried twice to approach, but Walter kept moving. Grace became increasingly worried as they crossed several streets and entered an older neighborhood nearly 2 miles away. The houses changed there. Some were boarded up. Others stood empty behind temporary construction fencing. Orange survey flags punctured neglected lawns, and several windows carried notices announcing redevelopment. Nathan recognized the neighborhood. His stomach tightened. Walter stopped before a weathered one-story house with faded green siding and a sagging wooden porch. The yard had surrendered to weeds. One shutter hung crooked beside a dusty window, and an old mailbox leaned toward the road. Walter climbed the porch steps. Then he scratched desperately at the front door. Once, twice, again. His tail moved for the first time since leaving Grace's house. "He knows this place," Grace whispered. She knelt beside him and noticed something beneath his faded leather collar. The small metal edge Nathan had glimpsed weeks earlier had worked free. Grace pulled it forward. An address was engraved into the scratched surface. She looked at the house number. They matched. This was his home. Nathan said nothing. He already knew something Grace did not. This entire block belonged to Whitmore Development. His company had recently acquired the surrounding properties for a $420 million residential and commercial redevelopment project. Nathan had reviewed maps, budgets, and demolition schedules without ever imagining one of those numbered parcels contained Walter's entire past. The front door was not properly secured. Its damaged latch gave way when Grace pushed gently, and they remained near the entrance while calling out in case anyone was inside. No one answered. Walter entered first. Dust covered the floor, but the dog moved as if he remembered every corner. In the living room, Grace found photographs still hanging on one wall. Most showed the same man, George Bennett, a lean African-American man with a narrow, weathered face, close-cropped gray hair, and a military posture that age had never completely softened. In several photographs, he wore an army uniform from decades earlier. In others, he was older, smiling beside a much younger Walter. One picture showed George kneeling beside Walter as a puppy. Grace covered her mouth. "Oh, Walter." The Labrador stood beneath the photograph and stared upward. They found an old box beside a writing desk containing bills, photographs, and several envelopes that had never been mailed. A folded obituary among them explained what the silent house could not. George Bennett had died 11 months earlier at 76. A Vietnam-era Army veteran and retired city mechanic, he had apparently lived alone after his wife died years before. His short obituary mentioned no surviving children. Grace opened one unfinished letter addressed simply, "To whoever finds Walter." She read aloud. George explained that age had taken most of the people he loved. Walter had remained through illness, lonely holidays, and nights when old memories made sleep impossible. If George died first, he asked only that whoever found Walter not treat him as unwanted simply because he was old. "He's family," George had written. "Please let him finish his life knowing he still belongs somewhere." Grace lowered the page. Walter had settled against her legs. Nathan looked at the woman sitting on the dusty floor beside an abandoned dog and felt shame rise through him. George had feared dying before he could make certain Walter was safe. Grace had risked her lease to give Walter that safety. And Nathan was still pretending to be someone else because honesty frightened him. Tonight, he decided, he would tell her everything. But the next morning, Grace arrived for work at the neighborhood library shortly before 9. Near the circulation desk, a television was playing the local news. She almost walked past it. Then she heard a familiar name. Billionaire developer Nathan Whitmore today announced final approval for the $420 million Nashville redevelopment project. Grace stopped. Nathan appeared on the screen wearing a dark tailored suit, standing behind a podium bearing the Whitmore Development logo. The same blue-gray eyes. The same beard. The same man who had eaten roadside burgers with her and claimed to repair apartments for a living. Grace felt the room tilt. Then another line appeared beneath his photograph. "Demolition begins Monday." A map followed. Grace stepped closer. Among the properties marked for demolition was the faded greenhouse, where Walter had finally found his way home. Grace reached the redevelopment site shortly after 10 that morning. Temporary fencing surrounded the block. Construction vehicles lined the curb, and men in hard hats moved between survey markers beneath a pale winter sky. Near the center stood Nathan, but not the Nathan she knew. He wore a charcoal suit beneath a black wool coat, his dark hair neatly styled, his beard precisely trimmed. Around him clustered architects, attorneys, and project managers carrying tablets and rolled plans. "Mr. Whitmore, the demolition contractor needs final authorization," one employee said. The title struck Grace harder than seeing him on television. Nathan turned. The moment he saw her, the composed billionaire disappeared from his face. "Grace." She walked toward him holding Walter's leash. The old Labrador moved slowly beside her, his gray muzzle lowered. Nathan dismissed the others. "I was going to tell you last night. But you didn't." "I know." Grace's voice remained controlled, which somehow made her anger sharper. Was Nathan the maintenance worker ever real? Nathan looked at the ground. The job wasn't. The apartment? No. The old truck. Daniel's. A bitter little laugh escaped her. Nathan told her about years of meeting women whose behavior changed after discovering his wealth. He explained the speed dating experiment, how he wanted one evening in which nobody knew his name or bank account. "At first, I wanted to know whether someone could care about me when they thought I had nothing." Grace stared at him. "And did I pass?" Nathan flinched. "That's not what you became to me, but that's what I started as." She reached into her coat pocket and removed the old brass key they had found inside George Bennett's desk. "You had every right to protect your heart," Grace said. "But you had no right to turn someone else's heart into a test." She placed the key in Nathan's palm. "You didn't test me, Nathan. You lied to me." Walter looked between them, confused by the tension. Nathan crouched and touched the Labrador's gray head. Walter leaned into his hand automatically. That nearly broke Grace. She gently pulled the leash. "Come on, Walter." Nathan wanted to follow. Every instinct told him to explain more, promise more, offer something large enough to stop her from leaving. He remained where he was. For once, money could not purchase the outcome he wanted. 3 days later, Whitmore Development's board assembled for an emergency meeting. Nathan stood before a wall-sized rendering of the $420 million project, while 11 executives waited around the polished table. Among them was Martin Hale, Whitmore Development's 61-year-old chief operating officer, a lean, silver-haired man with rectangular glasses and a severe, clean-shaven face. Martin had spent 3 decades turning complicated developments into profitable ones. He respected Nathan deeply, but believed sentiment belonged at home and numbers belonged in boardrooms. Nathan placed George's key on the table. "We're redesigning the western section." Martin frowned. "Demolition contracts are signed. Then amend them." Nathan explained that George Bennett's house would remain, so would nearly 4 acres surrounding it. Martin removed his glasses. "Nathan, changing the site plan now could cost millions." "I know. For one abandoned house. For what the house taught me." Nathan proposed something none of them expected. George's home would become the center of a sanctuary for senior dogs whose owners had died, entered long-term care, or could no longer care for them. The surrounding land would provide quiet exercise yards, veterinary space, foster facilities, and small rooms designed to feel like homes rather than kennels. "What are you calling it?" someone asked. Nathan looked at George's worn key. "The Last Home Sanctuary." Martin studied him. "Is this about Grace?" Nathan was silent for several seconds. "She showed me where I was wrong," he finally said. "But no, if I'm doing this so she'll come back, then I haven't learned anything." He issued one more instruction. Grace's name would appear nowhere. No press conference built around her kindness. No photographs. No dramatic donation presented for cameras. No attempt to turn the sanctuary into an apology she would feel obligated to accept. Nathan would fund it and accept the financial consequences. Whether Grace ever returned was her choice. That evening, Nathan went alone to George's house. Walter was gone. Grace was gone. The rooms felt larger without them. He placed the brass key on the old writing desk and looked at the photograph of George kneeling beside Walter as a puppy. Nathan had entered the speed dating room, believing he was testing the character of strangers. Standing inside an abandoned veteran's house, he finally understood who had actually failed. Him. Outside, survey crews began moving the demolition markers away from George Bennett's yard. For the first time in Nathan Whitmore's life, he changed something worth millions without needing anyone he loved to know he had done it. 6 months later, spring had softened Nashville. Fresh grass covered the once-neglected lots around George Bennett's house, while dogwood blossoms moved gently above new wooden fences beneath a warm Tennessee morning. The Last Home Sanctuary opened on a Saturday. Grace had known about it for weeks. She had seen a small announcement at the library and heard volunteers from the rescue discussing the project. Nathan had kept his promise. He never contacted her to advertise what he had done, never sent photographs, never placed her name beside the sanctuaries. During 6 months apart, Grace had occasionally wondered whether his silence meant he had forgotten her. A deeper part of her understood the opposite. For perhaps the first time, Nathan was respecting a boundary, even though doing so hurt him. Grace had no intention of attending the opening. Walter apparently disagreed. That morning, the 11-year-old Labrador ignored his breakfast. He stood beside Grace's front door, whining softly. When she attached his leash for their usual walk, Walter pulled toward her car instead of the sidewalk. "You've become very opinionated for someone who sleeps 16 hours a day," Grace murmured. Walter stared at her. 20 minutes later, Grace surrendered. When her Honda turned onto George's old street, she barely recognized it. The abandoned properties surrounding the house had been transformed into broad fenced yards with shaded resting areas and low ramps for elderly dogs. A modest veterinary building stood farther back. George's faded greenhouse remained at the center exactly where it had always been, but its siding had been repaired and the porch strengthened. Even George's weathered wooden chair remained beside the front door. Grace stopped breathing for a moment. Then she saw Nathan. He was nowhere near the small group gathered by the entrance. There was no suit, podium, camera crew, or ceremonial ribbon in his hands. He wore muddy jeans, work boots, and a faded gray shirt, kneeling beside a damaged section of fencing with 2 volunteers. He looked up. Their eyes met across the yard. Neither moved. Walter made the decision for them. The leash slipped through Grace's fingers as the Labrador surged forward. His arthritic rear legs could no longer produce the effortless speed of youth, but Walter ran with everything age had left him. "Walter!" Nathan stood. For 1 second, Grace thought the dog was running toward him. Walter passed him. He headed directly for George's house. The old Labrador climbed the porch steps, paused beside the wooden chair, and sniffed the boards. Then he turned 3 slow circles and lowered himself onto the exact patch of porch visible in the old photograph Grace had found months earlier. His gray head settled between his paws. He was home. Grace covered her mouth, but the tears came anyway. Nathan approached slowly and stopped several feet away, leaving the remaining distance to her. "I kept the chair," he said. "I see that. I almost replaced it. It was falling apart." Grace wiped her cheek. George would probably have complained. Nathan smiled faintly. So did the carpenter. Silence followed, but it no longer felt hostile. Nathan looked toward Walter. "I can't undo the lie," he said, "and I can't ask you to pretend it didn't matter. But I can become someone who doesn't need to lie anymore." He did not ask forgiveness. That mattered. Grace studied him for a long moment. "If we ever try again, Nathan, you don't get to continue where we stopped." He nodded. "Okay. We start over. From the beginning? The actual beginning." Grace almost smiled. "One first date. Your real name. Your real job. Your real life. No disguise. No tests. No secrets." Nathan extended his hand as though introducing himself to a stranger. "Nathan Whitmore, 43, real estate developer, terrible carpenter." Grace looked at his hand before taking it. "Grace Miller, 32, librarian, still not impressed by real estate developers." Nathan laughed. Walter lifted his head briefly, decided nothing required his intervention, and went back to sleep. 1 year later, the last home sanctuary had become home to dozens of senior dogs. Grace eventually left the library to become director of its volunteer program, coordinating foster families and helping elderly owners make plans for pets they feared leaving behind. Nathan continued running Whitmore Development, but he spent more Saturdays repairing fences than anyone on his executive board considered reasonable. Walter became the sanctuary's first permanent resident. Late one Tennessee afternoon, Grace and Nathan sat together on George's restored porch while sunlight stretched across the grass. Walter slept beside them in his familiar place. There was no billionaire sitting beside an ordinary woman anymore. No test subject and no man hiding behind a borrowed life. Only 2 people who had finally learned something an unwanted old dog seemed to understand long before they did. Love does not begin when someone passes the tests we create for them. Sometimes it begins only after we become brave enough to stop testing them at all. Maybe the greatest miracle in Nathan's story was never his fortune, the sanctuary, or even the abandoned house Walter somehow remembered after all those years. Maybe the miracle began much earlier, in the rain, beneath a parked car, when Grace saw an old dog everyone else had walked past and decided he was still worth stopping for. Walter could not speak. He could not explain where he came from or why he needed to return home. Yet somehow, that old dog led 2 wounded hearts exactly where they needed to go. And perhaps that is how God sometimes works in our lives. Not always through thunder from heaven or miracles we immediately recognize, but through small encounters we almost overlook. A stranger who needs kindness, an animal that crosses our path, a door we never planned to open, or even a disappointment that quietly leads us somewhere better. Nathan believed he needed to test people before trusting them. Grace showed him that real love cannot grow where there is no truth. And Walter reminded them both that being old, forgotten, or abandoned never means being without value. Maybe someone watching this today is carrying disappointment from the past. Maybe someone betrayed your trust. Maybe you have been waiting so long for something good that you have started wondering whether God has forgotten where you are. Don't let yesterday's pain make every person you meet tomorrow pay the price. Keep your heart wise, but leave a little room for kindness. Leave a little room for forgiveness. And above all, leave a little room for God to surprise you. Because sometimes the road that feels like a wrong turn is the very road that leads us home. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who may need this message today. And tell us in the comments, do you believe animals sometimes enter our lives for a reason? If you enjoy stories about kindness, second chances, and the unexpected ways lives can change, please subscribe to the channel and join us for the next story. May God bless you, protect your family, bring peace to your home, and place the right people, and perhaps the right 4-legged friend, along your path when you need them most. And wherever you are watching from tonight, may you never forget, sometimes God's smallest messengers leave the biggest footprints on our hearts.